The evening rush had just begun, and the restaurant was already packed tight with people. It was one of those fancy places in the middle of the city where the lights are dim, the napkins are made of thick cloth, and the smallest plate of food costs more than what most people earn in a day. The air smelled like expensive perfume, fresh steak, and the sharp tang of wine. Every table was full, and the noise level was rising fast. Glasses clinked together, silverware rattled against plates, and the sound of loud conversations bounced off the high ceilings. In the middle of all this chaos was Clara. She was a woman in her mid-30s, moving through the crowded room like a ghost. She wore the standard black uniform that all the waitresses had to wear, with a white apron tied tightly around her waist. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her shoes were sensible black flats that had seen better days. She had been working here for 3 years, and in all that time, she had learned the art of being invisible. She carried a large tray high above her shoulder, navigating the narrow gaps between tables without spilling a single drop. Her face was calm, but if you looked closely, you could see the tiredness in her eyes. Her feet throbbed with every step she took. She stopped at a table in the center of the room, where a group of 4 men were laughing loudly and talking about business deals. They didn't even look up as she placed their drinks down. To them, she wasn't a person with a name or a life. She was just a hand that refilled water and brought food. "Can we get some more bread over here?" one of the men asked without even making eye contact, waving his hand in the air like he was swatting away a fly. "Of course, right away," Clara said softly, forcing a smile that she didn't really feel. She turned and walked away, heading back toward the kitchen. The swinging doors burst open as she approached, and a waiter rushed past her, nearly bumping into her shoulder. The kitchen was a world of its own, hot, loud, and stressful. Chefs were shouting orders, pans were sizzling, and steam was rising from the stoves. Clara grabbed a basket of bread, took a deep breath to steady herself, and turned back around to face the dining room. She hated nights like this. It wasn't just the physical tiredness, it was the feeling of being small. She felt like a cog in a machine, doing the same thing over and over again, day after day. She wondered if anyone really saw her. She wondered if anyone cared that she had dreams once, just like the people sitting in those velvet chairs. As she walked back to the table with the bread, her path took her past the far corner of the restaurant. This was the quietest spot in the whole place. Tucked away in the shadows, standing on a small raised platform, was a beautiful grand piano. It was glossy black and shone under the spotlight that was aimed at it, even though nobody was sitting there. Clara slowed down. She couldn't help it. Every time she walked past this piano, it was like a magnet pulling at her. She stopped for just a second, balancing the bread basket in one hand while she let her other hand hover over the cold, smooth surface of the piano lid. Usually, a pianist came in at 7 o'clock to play dinner music. But tonight, the stool was empty. The piano stood silent, waiting for someone to bring it to life. It looked so peaceful compared to the rest of the noisy, chaotic restaurant. For a moment, Clara let her mind wander. She remembered being a little girl, standing on a crate so she could reach the keys of an old upright piano in her grandmother's living room. She remembered how the music felt. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling that started in her toes and rushed up through her fingers. It was the only time she ever felt truly free. Back then, everyone told her she was special. They told her she was going to be a star. But life had a funny way of changing things. Bills had to be paid, family members got sick, and slowly, the music stopped. The dreams were packed away in a box, just like the old photos in her closet. Clara looked at the keys now, black and white, silent and still. Her fingers twitched slightly. She ached to sit down. She wanted to just play one chord, to feel the vibration of the strings under her hands, even if it was just for a few seconds. She imagined the silence of the room, the feel of the ivory keys, and the sound of a melody filling the air. But then, a loud burst of laughter from a nearby table shattered the daydream. Clara quickly pulled her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. She looked around, feeling a sudden flush of embarrassment, even though nobody was watching her. She realized she was just standing there, staring at the instrument while holding a basket of bread. She looked ridiculous. "Clara! Table 5 is waiting for their check," a voice shouted from across the room. It was the manager, looking stressed and pointing at his watch. She snapped back to reality instantly. The longing in her chest was pushed down deep, buried under the weight of her duties. She wasn't a concert pianist. She wasn't a little girl with big dreams anymore. She was Clara, the waitress who needed to move fast if she wanted to get a tip tonight. "Yes, coming," she called out, her voice sounding small in the large room. She adjusted the heavy tray on her arm, smoothed down her apron, and turned her back on the piano. She walked away quickly, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. As she moved back into the crowd, she disappeared again, becoming just another part of the background noise. The piano sat behind her, silent and waiting, holding onto a secret that nobody in the crowded restaurant would have ever guessed. The room was full of people, but the only one who truly understood the magic sitting in the corner was the woman everyone was ignoring. The restaurant was getting louder and louder as the night went on. It was that time of the evening when every single table was occupied, and the line of people waiting for a table at the door was getting longer. The air conditioning was struggling to keep the room cool, and the windows were fogging up from the heat of the crowd. Usually, at this time of night, the restaurant had a specific rhythm to it. There was the low hum of conversation mixed with the soft, elegant sound of the grand piano in the corner. The piano music acted like a blanket, smoothing out the rough edges of the noise, making the place feel fancy and calm. But tonight, that rhythm was broken. In the corner of the room, the piano bench was empty. About an hour ago, the pianist, an older man who had been playing there for years, suddenly stood up in the middle of a song. He looked pale and clammy. He had clutched his chest, muttered something to the manager, and rushed out the door before his drink could even be served. Since then, the instrument had sat silent. Without the music, the restaurant felt different. It felt naked. Instead of a classy hum, the room was filled with the harsh clatter of dishes, the loud scraping of knives on plates, and people talking over each other to be heard. The atmosphere was quickly shifting from relaxing to chaotic. The owner of the restaurant, a tall man who usually walked around with a smile on his face, was now pacing back and forth behind the bar counter. He kept looking at his watch and then looking at the empty piano stool. He looked like he was about to pull his hair out. For a place like this, the ambience was everything. People paid high prices not just for the food, but for the experience. He could feel the mood in the room dropping. The customers were getting restless. He saw a woman at a nearby table wave her hand impatiently, looking around with a frown because the noise was giving her a headache. He rushed out from behind the bar, dodging a waiter carrying a tray full of pasta, and went straight to the service station where the staff was gathering. He looked desperate. His eyes scanned the faces of the servers, the bartenders, and the busboys, looking for a miracle. "Okay, listen to me," the owner said, his voice tight with stress. I need someone to get on that piano. I don't care what you play, just play something. We can't have this silence. It's driving the customers crazy. The staff looked at each other with blank faces. One young bartender shrugged his shoulders. I can play the radio, boss, but that thing, he pointed at the grand piano. No way. I took lessons when I was 6, but I can't even read music anymore. A waitress laughed nervously. I can play chopsticks really well, but I don't think that's what they want to hear. The owner let out a frustrated groan. He looked at his phone, scrolling through his contacts, trying to think of anyone he could call who lived close enough to get there in 5 minutes. But it was a Friday night. Every musician in the city was probably already booked at a gig or out having dinner. He was out of options. The silence in the corner was getting louder by the minute. He could feel the tension in his chest tightening. If the mood didn't improve, people were going to start leaving bad reviews or asking for their money back. While this panic was unfolding near the bar, Clara was in the corner, wiping down a small table near the entrance. She was listening to everything. She watched the owner's face turn red with frustration. She watched the staff shrug their shoulders. She looked over at the empty piano. It was just sitting there, looking beautiful and lonely. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It was a strange feeling, like a flutter in her chest. She knew she could play. She knew she could sit down and fill that silence with something beautiful. But the fear was holding her back. She was just a waitress. She was the woman who brought the bread and filled the water glasses. If she walked over there and tried to play and it sounded bad, or if she forgot the notes, she would be the laughingstock of the whole restaurant. The idea of all those well-dressed people staring at her, judging her, made her hands shake. She gripped the cleaning cloth tightly. Don't be stupid, she told herself. Just keep your head down and do your job. But then she saw the owner put his head in his hands, looking defeated. He looked over at the customers, who were now visibly annoyed. A man had just shouted at a waiter because the noise was too loud. The vibe of the restaurant was crumbling. Clara felt a sudden pang of sympathy. She knew what it was like to work hard and have things fall apart. She couldn't just watch it happen. Before she could talk herself out of it, her feet started moving. She walked away from the table she was cleaning and headed toward the service station where the owner was still arguing with the staff. "Excuse me," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, and at first, nobody heard her. The owner was on his phone, leaving a voicemail. "Hi, it's me. Listen, are you busy? I need a favor." Clara took a step closer. "Excuse me, sir." The owner looked up, annoyed at the interruption. He saw Clara, the quiet waitress who never caused any trouble. He lowered his phone. "What is it, Clara? I'm kind of in the middle of a crisis here." "I can play," she said. The words came out fast, like she was ripping off a bandage. The owner frowned, looking confused. "You can play what you mean, the radio?" Clara took a deep breath and pointed a trembling finger toward the corner. "The piano. I can play. I mean, I used to play. A long time ago." The owner stared at her. He looked at her worn-out black shoes, her plain uniform, and her tired face. Then he looked at the expensive, gleaming grand piano. It didn't compute. To him, she was just a worker. He had seen her hundreds of times, carrying trays and wiping tables. The idea that she possessed a hidden talent like that seemed impossible. He let out a short, skeptical laugh. "Look, Clara, I appreciate the offer, really, he said, rubbing his temples. But that is a Steinway. I need a professional. I need music that makes people want to order dessert. I can't have you banging out Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star up there. I promise I won't bang, Clara said, her voice getting a little stronger. She felt a rush of adrenaline. I know how to play real songs. Classical, jazz. I can do it. Just let me try. If it's bad, I'll stop, and you can figure something else out. The owner hesitated. He looked back at the dining room. A family was getting up to leave early. A couple at the window was looking around with annoyed expressions. He was completely out of options. The silence was killing his business. He looked at Clara's face again. For the first time, he noticed something in her eyes, a seriousness, a determination that he hadn't seen before. Okay, he said slowly, still unsure. Okay, fine. Just go buy us some time. 10 minutes. Just play something soft and don't make a scene. I'm still trying to find a replacement. Thank you, Clara said quickly. She didn't wait for him to change his mind. She turned and walked toward the corner of the room. As she walked, she felt the eyes of the other staff members on her. She could hear the whispers behind her back. Is she serious? She heard the bartender whisper. Clara plays since when? Another voice murmured. She kept walking, trying to block out the doubts. Her legs felt heavy, like she was walking through water. With every step, the piano got bigger. It looked majestic and intimidating under the spotlight. She felt like an imposter. She felt like she was walking onto a stage without a costume. When she reached the platform, the noise of the restaurant was deafening. People were laughing loudly, arguing about bills, and shouting orders. No one noticed her. She was still just the waitress walking to the corner to maybe adjust a chair or clean a glass. She stepped up onto the small platform and sat down on the bench. It was cold and hard. The piano loomed over her, a giant beast made of wood and wire. She looked at the black and white keys. They were so close. The smell of the polished wood filled her nose, a smell that brought back 1,000 memories. She reached up and slowly undid the top button of her uniform blouse. It felt too tight suddenly. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. She was terrified. The owner had given her 10 minutes to prove she wasn't a joke. Clara placed her hands on her lap. She wiggled her fingers, shaking off the tension. She was just a waitress from a few moments ago, but sitting there, she realized she had the power to change everything. She looked out at the sea of people, none of whom had any idea what was about to happen. She closed her eyes for a brief second, pictured her grandmother's old piano, and let the music take over her mind. Then, she lifted her hands and placed them gently on the keys, ready to shatter the silence. The walk from the service station to the corner of the room felt like the longest journey Clara had ever taken. It was only a distance of maybe 50 feet, but with every step she took, the air seemed to get heavier. Her heart was pounding so hard against her ribs that she was surprised the people sitting at the tables near the aisle couldn't hear it. She gripped the sides of her apron to keep her hands from shaking, trying to look as normal as possible, but she felt like a spotlight was burning a hole right through her back. As she moved through the dining area, the reality of what she was about to do started to crash down on her. All around her, life was going on as usual. To her left, a young couple was sharing a dessert, laughing at a joke, completely unaware that the woman clearing the table next to them was about to do something crazy. To her right, a man in a sharp gray suit was talking loudly on his phone, complaining about a business deal. He didn't even move out of the way when Clara walked by, he just expected her to squeeze past him like she always did. She caught the eye of one of the other waiters, a young guy named Tom who usually worked the bar station. He was carrying a tray of dirty glasses. He stopped in his tracks and stared at her with wide eyes. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to say something, maybe to ask if she was crazy, but no words came out. He just shook his head slowly, a look of pure confusion on his face. That look almost made Clara turn around. It reminded her that she was stepping out of line. Waitresses didn't sit at the customer pianos. It broke the rules of the world they lived in. But she kept going. She thought about the owner's desperate face. She thought about the empty, silent corner of the room that used to be filled with such beautiful music. More than anything, she thought about the burning feeling in her chest that had been there for years, the feeling that she was hiding who she really was. She had to try, even if it ended in disaster. Finally, she reached the small raised platform where the piano sat. Up close, the instrument looked even more magnificent than it did from across the room. The black polish was mirror-like, reflecting the crystal lights hanging from the ceiling. It was a stark contrast to Clara. She looked down at her worn black shoes, which were scuffed from months of walking on hard floors, and then at her hands, which were red and rough from scrubbing dishes and carrying hot trays. She felt like a mess standing next to something so perfect and clean. The noise of the restaurant was overwhelming. A waiter dropped a metal spoon with a loud clatter that echoed through the room. A baby started crying near the entrance. A group of women laughed loudly at a table nearby. Nobody was paying attention to the corner. The piano was just a piece of furniture to them, and Clara was just the staff member about to move a chair or wipe the dust off the lid. Clara took a deep breath and stepped up onto the platform. The wood creaked very softly under her weight. She turned around and sat down on the bench. It was stiff and firm, much harder than the chairs she usually sat on during her break. She felt very exposed. She was sitting with her back to most of the room, looking out at the crowd. Usually, she spent her whole night trying not to be looked at, but now she was putting herself right in the line of sight. She adjusted her position on the bench, wiggling back and forth until she felt comfortable. She reached out with her foot and found the gold pedal near the floor. She pressed it down gently, just to feel the resistance. It felt familiar. It felt like coming home after being away for a very long time. From the table closest to the piano, a man in a blue suit looked up from his plate. He had a thick mustache and a glass of red wine in his hand. He frowned when he saw Clara sitting there. He leaned over to the woman he was with and whispered something, pointing a finger in Clara's direction. The woman looked up, smirked, and then went back to eating her food. They both thought it was a joke. They thought she was confused, or perhaps just taking a rest where she wasn't supposed to be. Clara saw the man pointing. She saw the smirk on the woman's face. A hot wave of embarrassment washed over her face, turning her cheeks bright red. For a second, panic gripped her throat. "What am I doing?" a voice screamed inside her head. "I don't belong here. I'm going to embarrass myself. I'm going to play one wrong note and everyone is going to laugh at me. They will fire me. I will lose my job." Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling visibly. She pulled them back into her lap and rubbed them on her apron, trying to dry the sweat that had collected on her palms. She looked at the sea of faces. People were eating, drinking, talking on phones, cutting steak. They were in their own little worlds, unaware that a silent battle was taking place on the piano bench. She closed her eyes tight. She blocked out the image of the man in the blue suit. She blocked out the sound of the clattering dishes. She blocked out the smell of the food and the pressure of the uniform. She tried to remember who she used to be. Before the bills. Before the exhaustion. Before she became invisible. She remembered the music. She remembered how it felt to let go of all the worry and just let the sound take over. She realized that in that moment, it didn't matter what the man in the blue suit thought. It didn't matter if the other waiters were confused. The only thing that mattered was the silence, and the fact that she had the power to fill it. Slowly, the trembling in her hands stopped. Her breathing slowed down. The fear was still there, hiding in the back of her mind, but it was smaller now. A different feeling was taking its place. It was a feeling of focus, of determination. It was a strength she didn't know she still had. She opened her eyes again. Her expression had changed. The worried, tired look of the waitress was gone, replaced by a look of intense concentration. Her jaw was set tight. Her eyes were locked on the keys, not looking at the crowd anymore. She reached out and placed her left hand on the low end of the keyboard. The keys felt cool and smooth under her fingertips. Then, she placed her right hand on the higher notes. She flexed her fingers, stretching them wide. Her hands looked surprisingly graceful hovering over the white and black pattern. They didn't look like hands that scrubbed floors anymore, they looked like tools of an artist. The restaurant was still loud. The noise level hadn't dropped at all. Nobody was waiting for her to start. They were all too busy with their own lives to notice the quiet transformation happening in the corner. The baby was still crying. The man in the gray suit was still shouting into his phone. Clara took one last, deep breath. She filled her lungs with the air of the restaurant, the good and the bad, and held it for a second. She felt the vibration of the floor under her feet. She felt the weight of the expectation she had placed on herself. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. In that moment, sitting on the hard bench in her cheap uniform, she was a musician. And the room had no idea what was about to hit it. She pressed down on the keys, ready to break the silence with a sound that would stop the world. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the restaurant seemed to crack open. Clara didn't start with a soft, gentle melody to test the waters. She didn't play a polite hello to the room. Instead, she slammed her hands down on the low notes with a force that vibrated through the floorboards and up the legs of the tables. The sound was like a sudden thunderclap on a clear day. It was a roar, a declaration that something had changed. For the first second, nobody reacted. It was as if their brains couldn't process what their ears were hearing. The noise was so big, so aggressive, and so full of emotion that it didn't fit in the room. It sounded like a symphony orchestra had suddenly hidden itself inside the piano. Then, the heads started to turn. At the table near the window, the man in the gray suit was still shouting into his phone about a contract. When the first thunderous chord hit, he stopped mid-sentence. He froze with the phone pressed to his ear, his mouth hanging open. He looked around, annoyed, trying to find the source of the interruption. His eyes landed on the corner of the room, on the waitress in the apron, and his expression instantly changed from annoyance to total confusion. The music didn't stop. As soon as the thunder died down, Clara's right hand began to dance. It wasn't a simple tune. It was a fast, complicated run of notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall. It was incredibly fast, faster than anyone thought human hands could move. Her fingers were a blur of motion, leaping from one end of the piano to the other. The contrast was shocking to watch. Just moments ago, This woman was struggling to carry a tray of bread. Now, she was taming a beast of an instrument with the power of a master. The black and white keys were no longer separate objects, they were extensions of her arms. She didn't look like a tired waitress anymore. Her back was straight, her shoulders were back, and her head was held high. She looked fierce. The silence in the room began to spread. It started near the piano and moved outward like a ripple in a pond. The clatter of silverware stopped. People stopped chewing. The laughter died away. Waitresses who were walking to the kitchen froze in their tracks, holding heavy trays, their eyes locked on the corner. It wasn't just that the music was loud, it was that it was alive. The piece she was playing was full of anger and passion. It wasn't the boring, background elevator music they were used to. This music had teeth. It snarled and bit. It was dramatic and intense. Every note told a story of struggle, of fighting against odds, of wanting to be heard. The people in the restaurant could feel it in their chests. It was impossible to ignore. The man with the thick mustache, who had been smirking earlier, slowly lowered his wine glass. He stared at Clara's back. His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. He looked at the woman he had treated like a servant just minutes ago and realized he had made a massive mistake. He watched her hands, amazed by the speed and precision. He turned to his dinner companion, but she was already staring, spellbound. Even the kitchen staff, who were usually hidden behind the double doors, started to peek out. They were used to hearing noise from the dining room, but this was different. Chefs in white hats and aprons stained with sauce stood in the doorway, wiping their hands on their cloths, listening. They couldn't see her face, but they could hear the power in the playing. They knew the girl who worked the floor. They knew she was tired and overworked. But they didn't know this. Clara was lost in a different world now. She couldn't see the staring faces. She couldn't see the dropped jaws. She had her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm of the music. She wasn't thinking about the rent, or her sore feet, or the rude customers. All she could feel was the music rushing through her veins. It was a release. Every time she struck a key, she was letting out a month's worth of frustration. It felt incredible. She felt powerful. The music began to rise to a climax. The notes got higher and faster, building a sense of tension that had everyone on the edge of their seats. It was like watching a storm gather strength. The sound filled every inch of the massive dining hall. The crystal lights overhead seemed to tremble in sympathy with the sound. A young couple, who had been sitting quietly looking bored with their dates, suddenly turned to look at each other. They didn't need to speak. They both felt it, the raw emotion in the air. The girl's eyes actually filled with tears, though she didn't know why. It was just so beautiful, so unexpected. It was the kind of beauty that hurts a little bit because it is so rare. The owner of the restaurant stood behind the bar, forgotten. He had stopped pacing. He had stopped worrying about the bad reviews. He was just watching, completely stunned. He had hired hundreds of musicians over the years, professionals with degrees from fancy schools. But none of them played like this. None of them had this kind of fire. He realized that for 3 years, the most talented person in his building had been pouring his coffee, and he had never even noticed. Clara's hands were moving so fast now that they were almost invisible. She was playing the most difficult part of the song, the part where most musicians would slow down or make a mistake. But she didn't slow down. She went faster. She attacked the keys with a kind of desperate energy. The sweat was dripping down her forehead, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't want to break the connection. The room was so quiet now that you could hear the soft squeak of the piano pedal under her foot. That was the only sound competing with the music. The air in the room felt charged, like electricity was running through the chairs and tables. Nobody dared to cough or sneeze. Nobody dared to whisper. They were all held captive by the sound. It was a collective trance. She played a series of deep, heavy chords that shook the floor, followed by a shower of light, delicate notes that floated up to the ceiling. It was a battle between the heavy and the light, the dark and the bright. Her face showed the effort. Her brow was furrowed, her teeth were slightly clenched. She was fighting the music, wrestling with it, and winning. The people watching forgot that she was a waitress. They forgot that she was wearing a uniform. They forgot their expensive dinners and their business problems. In that moment, the only thing that mattered in the entire world was the sound coming from that corner of the room. They were witnessing a miracle. They were seeing a diamond shining in a pile of coal. As the song rushed toward its final moments, the tempo increased. It was a whirlwind of sound. The patrons were leaning forward, their hearts beating faster in time with the rhythm. They could feel the end coming, and they didn't want it to stop. They wanted it to last forever. The man in the gray suit had completely forgotten his phone call, the person on the other end had hung up minutes ago, but he was still holding the phone to his ear, deaf to everything but the piano. Clara took a deep breath, her fingers flying across the keys for the last sprint. She was giving it everything she had. She was pouring her soul out into the room, naked and raw, not caring about the consequences. The sound swelled, filling the space, pushing against the walls, demanding to be felt. And then, with a sudden, sharp intake of breath, she began the final descent, bringing the music to a place where everyone knew it had to end, but they weren't ready for it. With one final, sweeping motion of her arms, Clara brought the song to its close. She struck the last chord with such power that the strings inside the massive wooden instrument seemed to sing in protest. It was a sound that started in her toes and exploded out through her fingertips. She held her hands pressed down on the keys, letting the final note hang in the air, heavy and full of vibration. She didn't lift them immediately. She wanted to freeze time, to keep the magic alive for just one more second. During that moment of suspension, the restaurant was transformed. It was no longer a noisy dining hall filled with self-important people, it was a cathedral. The air was thick with emotion. The sound of the piano faded slowly, echoing off the high ceilings and the glass windows, until the vibrations disappeared into the walls. Then, there was absolute silence. It wasn't the awkward kind of silence where people clear their throats or look at their phones. It was a heavy, stunned silence. Nobody moved. Waitresses stood frozen with trays hovering in mid-air. The man in the gray suit still held his dead phone to his ear, his mouth open, but he wasn't making a sound. Even the chefs had stopped working in the kitchen doorway, their eyes wide, staring at the woman in the black apron. For 10 long seconds, nobody breathed. It was as if the whole world had stopped spinning just to listen to the echo of what she had done. Then, slowly, Clara lifted her hands off the keys. The movement broke the spell. The sound started from the back of the room. It was a single clap, sharp and loud. Then another. And then, suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar. It started like a crack of thunder and grew into a deafening wave. People jumped up from their seats. The man in the gray suit threw his phone onto the table so he could clap with both hands. The woman who had been crying was wiping her eyes and clapping harder than anyone else. Clara flinched as the noise hit her. The adrenaline that had been fueling her began to drain away, leaving her legs feeling weak and shaky. The magic bubble she had been living in popped, and she was suddenly back in the real world. She looked out at the crowd with wide, frightened eyes. She saw hundreds of faces turn toward her, but they weren't looking through her anymore. They were seeing her. Really seeing her. And it was terrifying. She didn't stand up to take a bow like a star at a concert hall. She stayed seated for a moment, her hands trembling in her lap, her face turning bright red. She felt naked, exposed, and incredibly vulnerable. She had poured her heart out, and now everyone was staring at the mess she had made. Finally, she managed to stand up. She gave a quick, awkward nod to the room. She didn't know what to do with her hands, so she smoothed down her apron again. The applause only got louder when she stood. A few people shouted, "Bravo!" An encore. But Clara didn't want an encore. She wanted to hide. She turned and practically ran off the small platform. Her shoes squeaked on the floor as she hurried away from the spotlight, ducking her head low. She didn't look at the owner. She didn't look at her co-workers. She just wanted to get back to the safety of the kitchen, to the place where she was just invisible Clara again. As she moved through the room, the atmosphere shifted completely. The path she took to the kitchen was usually a gauntlet of ignoring people, but tonight, the customers parted like the Red Sea. They reached out to her as she passed. A man in an expensive suit touched her arm gently as she walked by, not to stop her, but just to show respect. "That was beautiful," he whispered, his voice full of genuine awe. "Thank you," Clara whispered back, her voice barely audible, looking down at the floor. She kept moving. A young woman sitting near the aisle reached out and tried to hand her a $20 bill. "Please, take this," the girl said, her eyes shining. "You were amazing." Clara shook her head frantically. No, I can't," she stammered, sidestepping the offer. She felt like crying. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. It was too much. She finally reached the swinging doors of the kitchen and pushed through them, escaping the noise and the lights. She leaned back against the cold metal door and let out a long, shuddering breath. Her heart was still racing. She looked down at her hands. They were still shaking, but now they felt like they belonged to someone else. She slid down until she was sitting on the floor, burying her face in her hands for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Inside the dining room, the applause eventually died down, but the mood had changed permanently. The buzz of conversation returned, but it was different now. People weren't talking about business deals or stocks. They were talking about her. "Did you see that?" the man with the thick mustache said to his table, his voice filled with wonder. "She works here. I've been coming here for years, and I never knew." "I thought she was going to be terrible," his friend admitted, looking sheepish. "I feel terrible for thinking that. She's a genius." The owner walked slowly out from behind the bar. He walked over to the piano and looked at it, as if checking to see if it was a different instrument. Then he looked toward the kitchen doors where Clara had disappeared. He felt a strange mix of emotions: guilt for not noticing her talent sooner, pride that she worked for him, and shock that he had been so blind. He realized that for years, the most incredible artist in the city had been serving drinks right under his nose, and he had treated her like a servant. After a few minutes in the kitchen, composing herself, Clara stood up. She splashed some cold water on her face from the sink and tied her apron strings tight again. She looked in the small mirror near the prep station. The tired waitress looked back at her, but her eyes were different now. They held a spark that hadn't been there before. She pushed back through the swinging doors. She wasn't sure what she expected, but the reaction was immediate. Every head turned. The busboys stopped clearing tables. The other waitresses looked at her with a mixture of jealousy and awe. But mostly, there was respect. She walked over to the table where the man in the gray suit was sitting. He was just finishing his meal. Before she could ask if he wanted the check, he stood up. "You," he said, looking at her with a serious expression. "You have a gift. Why are you waiting tables?" Clara blushed, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks again. She looked down at her notepad. I have to pay the bills," she said softly. "Well, you shouldn't be hiding that," the man said firmly. "That was the best thing I've heard in 10 years. Thank you for sharing it with us." He left a tip on the table that was so big it covered the entire receipt. Clara stared at it, stunned. She picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hand. The night went on, and Clara went back to work. She cleared tables. She refilled water glasses. She wiped down crumbs. But the "Do Not Disturb" sign that had hung over her for years was gone. People smiled at her as she walked by. They stopped her to ask questions about the music, about her life, about how she learned to play like that. For the first time, she wasn't a ghost. She was the most important person in the room. At the end of the shift, the restaurant was emptying out. The music was gone, and the piano sat silent in the corner again. Clara was tired, exhausted in a way she had never felt before. Her bones ached, but her spirit felt light. The owner came over to her as she was taking off her apron. He looked a bit nervous. "Clara," he said. "That was incredible." "Thank you," she said, smiling a small, humble smile. "Listen," the owner continued, scratching the back of his neck. "I know I never asked before, but, do you have a card or a number? I want to hire you to play here. For real. Not as a waitress. As the pianist. We'll pay you properly. Double what you make now." Clara looked at him, then over at the piano. It was sitting there, waiting for her. She thought about the fear she had felt before she sat down, and how different the world looked now because she had faced it. "I'd like that," she said simply. Clara hung up her apron on the hook by the wall. She walked out of the restaurant, not through the side door like the staff usually did, but through the front door, into the cool night air. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a musician, and finally, the world had heard her song.